He stood over 2 meters tall, yet the darkest thing about Edmund Kemper was the secret he carried behind his calm, intelligent smile. How could a man so articulate hide urges that defied logic, terror, and humanity itself? What twisted contradiction allowed him to charm those who would become his victims? Stay with me, because this story exposes the chilling evolution of the co-ed killer in a way few have ever heard. Edmund Kemper's story begins long before the world knew his name, in a childhood shaped by emotional violence rather than physical blows. Born in Northern California during the mid-1940s, he entered a home defined by conflict. His father, a war veteran exhausted by responsibility, withdrew from family life. His mother, struggling with resentment and instability, directed her frustrations toward her son. She belittled him, isolated him, and planted in him the belief that he was unwanted. This environment molded a boy who grew physically enormous yet emotionally hollow, seeking identity in a world that kept rejecting him. By the time Kemper reached adolescence, his height and strength outpaced his age. Teachers described him as intelligent, articulate, and observant. Yet beneath that exterior, a storm was forming. He spent hours alone, wandering through secluded areas, building a private world where he could exert control. As tension in the household grew, his fantasies intensified. The lines between frustration and darker impulses blurred. His size made others cautious, but internally he felt powerless, convinced that the only way to matter was through dominance. When his parents finally separated, the emotional damage deepened. Sent away from his father, whom he idolized, he was forced to live with a mother whose anger toward him became sharper with each passing year. She kept him locked in the basement at night, insisting that he was dangerous, that he could not be trusted around his sisters. These decisions carved deep wounds into the boy's psyche. He absorbed every word, every accusation, until the monster she insisted he was began to take form within him. A broken mirror reflecting back a distorted identity. By early adolescence, Kemper's inner world had grown darker. His behavior shifted from troubled to alarming. He felt drawn to the boundaries between life and death, fascinated by the power difference between predator and prey. These obsessions were not sudden. They developed like roots beneath the surface, quietly spreading through years of emotional neglect. His mother, overwhelmed and fearful, sought professional help for him, but by then the damage was already shaping his worldview. His behavior escalated to a point that forced authorities to intervene. Kemper committed acts that left no doubt he was spiraling into something dangerous, and soon he was placed into the hands of the juvenile justice system. The state declared him deeply troubled. Psychologists noted his intelligence, his calm demeanor, and his ability to articulate remorse, but they also saw the darker layers beneath, layers that suggested a capacity for severe violence. Still, few believed he posed an enduring threat. He was eventually confined to a secure facility for evaluation and rehabilitation. Yet to the professionals assigned to him, Kemper became a unique case. Unlike many adolescents, he was cooperative, thoughtful, and eager to understand his own behavior. Therapists saw potential. They noted his willingness to participate in treatment, his reflective nature, and the way he absorbed psychological concepts quickly. At times, he even assisted staff in analyzing other patients, his insight unsettling in its accuracy. He learned the language of mental health, the rhythms of behavior, and the strategies used to assess risk. This knowledge became a tool. Over the years in the institution, Kemper adapted, observing how adults responded to certain phrases, tones, and expressions. He built a version of himself that appeared stable, polite, rehabilitated. He learned how to present progress convincingly, how to align his language with what his doctors wanted to hear, and how to hide the parts of himself that continued to fester underneath. He understood that freedom depended not on change, but on performance. By the time he approached adulthood, professionals considered releasing him. Reports described him as reformed, intelligent, and capable of reintegration. They recommended returning him to society, believing that maturity, therapy, and supervision had corrected his path. When the doors finally opened, Kemper walked out not as a healed man, but as someone who had learned how to mask the storm inside him. He now possessed the vocabulary, the charm, and the psychological awareness to operate unnoticed. He moved back into the world with a new identity forming, one built on lessons learned behind institutional walls. But the environment he returned to was not stable, supportive, or safe. He was sent back to the very person who had shaped his earliest wounds, his mother. Their reunion would not soothe old scars. Instead, it would reignite the conflict that had defined his childhood and push him toward decisions the world would soon discover with horror. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter. And tell me in the comments, do you believe Kemper's environment shaped the darkness within him? Or was something far deeper at work? When Edmund Kemper returned to civilian life as a young adult, he stepped into a world that had no idea what he was capable of. The professionals who had evaluated him believed his intelligence and cooperation were signs of recovery. They saw promise where danger hid in plain sight. With his record sealed, his past erased from public view, he re-entered society with the clean slate of a man who had supposedly overcome his demons. But inside, the storm had not calmed. It had only grown more calculated. His release came with one devastating condition. He had to return to the home of the person who had shaped his earliest wounds. Living once again with his mother reignited the emotional chaos he thought he could escape. She remained harsh, critical, and unpredictable. Their interactions were collisions of bitterness and resentment, turning their home into a constant battle for psychological survival. She belittled him, questioned his worth, and reminded him repeatedly of the burden she believed he was. Their relationship, already fractured, deteriorated into a cycle of hostility neither could escape. Kemper spent much of his time outside the house, trying to find purpose, direction, and distance from the toxic environment inside. He worked small jobs, drove through quiet roads, and observed the world around him with an unsettling detachment. Despite his size, he moved quietly, almost invisible. He watched people closely, especially young women who walked alone near the local college campuses. His fascination with them grew stronger. They represented freedom, independence, and opportunity, everything he felt denied. But they also embodied vulnerability through his distorted lens. Still, he tried to anchor himself to normal routines. He bought a motorcycle, socialized occasionally, and attempted to date, though his interactions always ended awkwardly. His mother's criticisms echoed in every attempt. She told him he was too strange, too tall, too intimidating for any woman to want him. Each comment fueled a deeper resentment toward her, and toward the world she insisted he would never belong to. Inside him, frustration hardened into something sharper, darker, and harder to contain. He eventually found work with the California Highway Department, giving him structure and independence. The job demanded long hours and long drives. The solitude became both a refuge and a danger. He spent countless hours on the road, imagining scenarios, building fantasies, and feeding the impulses he had long kept buried. His intelligence allowed him to conceal these thoughts easily. To coworkers, he was quiet, polite, even helpful. No one suspected that inside his mind, violence was quietly taking shape. On weekends, he drove through the winding roads of Santa Cruz, watching students along the highways. He rehearsed interactions in his head, imagining how he might approach them, what he might say, how he could gain their trust. He studied the patterns of traffic, police patrols, and the routines of the young women he saw hitchhiking. The era normalized hitchhiking, turning it into a cultural phenomenon of freedom and adventure. Kemper saw it as a system built for exploitation. As the tension with his mother escalated, so did the intensity of his fantasies. Their arguments grew louder, sharper, and more frequent. She mocked his attempts at independence, dismissed his accomplishments, and reminded him of the failures she believed defined him. Each confrontation stripped away another layer of restraint. The emotional warfare inside their home reached a breaking point, leaving him constantly on edge. His resentments fused with his impulses, creating a dangerous combination that neither therapy nor structure could contain. At the same time, Kemper took a peculiar interest in the police officers who frequented the local cafe he visited. He befriended them, listened to their stories, and absorbed their insights. They viewed him as a large, harmless big guy who enjoyed conversation. He asked casual questions about investigations, procedures, and the subtle patterns of law enforcement behavior. His ability to appear calm and curious allowed him to gather information no one realized he was collecting. Their trust became another layer of armor. By now, he had created a carefully balanced life. Obedient son, reliable worker, friendly customer at the cafe, an attentive observer of the world around him. But the balance was fragile. He felt the pressure of his mother's disdain, the weight of isolation, and the pull of fantasies that seemed increasingly difficult to ignore. He spent nights alone in his small bedroom, replaying the arguments, the emotions, and the imaginary scenarios that offered him the control he never had in reality. It was during these moments, when the world was silent and the house was dark, that the first irreversible shift occurred. Kemper realized that the storm inside him was no longer just emotional. It was a compulsion demanding action. He began planning, not impulsively, but methodically, like a student preparing for an exam he knew he was destined to pass. The thoughts that once frightened him now felt inevitable. And with that realization, the path toward becoming the co-ed killer began to take its final, horrifying shape. Edmund Kemper's descent into violence did not begin with chaos, but with calculation. By the early 1970s, the emotional tension within him had reached a level it could no longer be contained. His arguments with his mother grew more intense, more personal, and more frequent. Each confrontation amplified the sense of invisibility he felt. She dismissed his ambitions, mocked his attempts at social interaction, and insisted that women would always avoid him. These words lodged themselves deep within his mind, reshaping his understanding of relationships, power, and rejection. The resentment he carried began to eclipse every attempt he made to lead a normal life. During long drives along the Pacific highways, Kemper rehearsed conversations with imaginary passengers. At first, these were harmless mental exercises, born of loneliness and a desire for connection. But gradually, the rehearsals changed. They became scenarios where he controlled every variable, every decision, every outcome. His intelligence allowed him to construct detailed plans, and the years he spent inside institutions had taught him how to appear composed even as darker impulses grew. He began picking up hitchhikers, at first with no malicious intent. He talked to them, drove them to their destinations, and observed how easily they trusted him. Each encounter taught him something new, how people reacted to his size, what tones put them at ease, what questions made them feel safe. He tested boundaries without crossing them, gaining insight into human behavior. These drives became experiments disguised as acts of kindness. To the outside world, he seemed helpful. Inside his mind, he was studying the vulnerabilities of strangers. He also built a private set of rules meant to keep his impulses under control. He repeated them to himself like a mantra. Pick them up, talk, learn, then let them go. For a while, he followed these rules strictly. He believed discipline alone could restrain the growing pressure inside him. But his life at home continued to fuel the internal conflict. Each night, he returned to an environment where his mother dismissed, controlled, and provoked him. The emotional weight of these interactions eroded the restraints he had built. As Kemper's resentment intensified, so did his desire to test the limits of his fantasies. He began driving with specific tools in his car items that signaled a shift from restraint to preparation. He justified them as precautionary or practical, but he knew their purpose extended far beyond that. His inner conflict deepened. He wanted control, yet feared what would happen if he acted. This duality created a psychological tension that grew impossible to ignore. At the same time, Kemper increased his presence around the local police officers he admired. They knew him by name, joked with him, and welcomed his company. This sense of acceptance gave him confidence. He felt protected, even validated by their trust. He learned how investigations unfolded, what raised suspicion, and what details officers overlooked. This knowledge became part of his planning, fueling the illusion that he could navigate both sides of the law without consequence. Then came the moment that shifted everything. One night, after another bitter argument with his mother, Kemper left the house in a state of emotional exhaustion. He drove without direction, letting the quiet roads of Santa Cruz absorb his frustration. Hours later, he encountered a pair of hitchhikers. Something inside him tightened resentment, curiosity, anger, and opportunity merging into a single irreversible decision. The rules he had repeated to himself for months fractured in an instant. That night marked the point where fantasies and reality collided. The internal restraints he had depended on no longer held. The carefully constructed persona of the polite giant dissolved, leaving room for the emergence of a persona molded by dominance, control, and long-suppressed rage. As the sun rose the next morning, Kemper realized something chilling. He did not feel shock. He felt clarity. The storm inside him had found an outlet, and the illusion that he could suppress it was gone forever. From that moment forward, the pattern of his life changed entirely. He began crafting strategies, refining methods, and building confidence in ways that made him increasingly dangerous. The co-ed killer was no longer forming, he had arrived. In the months that followed Edmund Kemper's first irreversible decision, something within him shifted in a way that even he had not anticipated. The emotional storm that once erupted unpredictably had settled into something far more unsettling. A calm, deliberate sense of purpose. He had crossed a psychological threshold, and now he moved through the world with a new, unnerving confidence. He understood that he could act without immediate consequence, and that realization emboldened him. Kemper began refining the patterns that would soon define his identity in the eyes of investigators and the public. He drove the familiar roads between Santa Cruz and the surrounding college towns, watching the ebb and flow of students who hitchhiked daily. He memorized their routines, their expressions, and the moments when they appeared most vulnerable. What others saw as a culture of freedom, he saw as a landscape of opportunity. He rehearsed stories, experimented with tones of voice, and perfected a calm demeanor that masked the turmoil beneath. His intelligence allowed him to navigate these encounters with unsettling precision. He also learned to monitor the environment around him with the scrutiny of someone who believed his survival depended on it. He watched police patrol patterns, traffic flows, and the quiet intervals when roads became temporarily empty. He adjusted his habits carefully, ensuring that no pattern of his own could be detected. He relied on chance encounters, spontaneous decisions, and the illusion of randomness, even though everything he did was anchored in method. This mix of calculation and opportunism made him difficult to predict. At home, the conflict with his mother remained constant, but now it served a different function. Each argument reinforced the resentment driving his actions. She continued to criticize him, dismiss his accomplishments, and remind him of the failures she believed he embodied. To Kemper, these confrontations became fuel. He no longer viewed her as merely a source of emotional pain, but as the root of every humiliation embedded in his psyche. This belief tightened its hold on him, shaping his worldview in ways that would later become crucial to understanding his motives. During this period, Kemper's interactions with law enforcement took on a new layer of irony. The officers he befriended admired his calm nature, his intelligence, and his dry sense of humor. They saw him as the friendly big guy who liked to talk shop. He listened as they discussed ongoing investigations in the area, including the sudden disappearances of college students. The conversations provided him with insight into the progress of the case, the theories detectives were considering, and the assumptions guiding their efforts. Kemper absorbed every detail, adjusting his own behavior accordingly. As the disappearances continued, public anxiety began to rise. Parents warned their daughters, flyers appeared on campus bulletin boards, and the atmosphere in Santa Cruz grew tense. The word co-ed killer started circulating among students even before police had a clear suspect. Yet few imagined that the man who regularly chatted with officers over coffee was quietly responsible. The contrast between his public persona and his private actions became the very thing that allowed him to move without suspicion. Kemper's confidence increased as he evaded detection. He felt invisible, protected by his ability to blend in and by the trust he had cultivated with those around him. This invisibility fed a sense of superiority, convincing him that he could orchestrate events with precision. His methods grew more rehearsed, his decisions more strategic, and his demeanor more controlled. He became obsessed not only with exerting power, but with perfecting the process itself. He learned to anticipate the questions police might ask, the evidence they might seek, and the errors that would expose him. Behind this facade of control, however, a deeper shift was taking place. Kemper's resentment toward his mother intensified with every passing week. The emotional battlefield in their home grew more volatile. Their conversations devolved into arguments that left both simmering with anger. To him, she embodied everything he claimed to despise: rejection, humiliation, and a sense of inferiority he could never fully escape. He began to fixate on her role in shaping his life, tracing every internal scar back to the years of belittlement and isolation she had imposed on him. As investigators grew increasingly desperate for leads, Kemper continued navigating his daily life with startling normality. He worked, he joked, he socialized, and he maintained the illusion of stability with ease. No one suspected that beneath the surface, a dangerous psychological equation was nearing its final result. His actions were escalating, both in frequency and in complexity. Each decision seemed to push him further toward a climax he felt was inevitable. And slowly, the target of his growing rage became unmistakably clear: the very woman who had defined his earliest wounds. As tension reached a breaking point inside their home, the trajectory of Kemper's violence changed direction. The storm he had unleashed on strangers was about to turn inward, toward the source he believed had shaped his identity from the beginning. As the tension between Edmund Kemper and his mother intensified, the fragile equilibrium he had maintained for years finally began to crumble. Their home in Santa Cruz had become an emotional battleground. Every conversation seemed to ignite an argument. Every attempt at normality collapsed under the weight of unresolved resentment. Kemper no longer saw these confrontations as isolated moments. He viewed them as the culmination of a lifetime spent under the shadow of a woman who had shaped him through fear, criticism, and rejection. Inside him, frustration hardened into conviction. The emotional prison she created could only end in one final confrontation. Meanwhile, the community outside remained unaware of the storm brewing inside the house. The disappearances of young women continued to haunt Santa Cruz, baffling investigators who struggled to link the cases together. Multiple agencies became involved, each pursuing different leads and theories. To some, the pattern suggested a lone predator. To others, the disappearances were unrelated. The lack of coordination made it difficult to form a cohesive picture. Yet the fear spreading across college campuses was unmistakable. Students stopped hitchhiking. Professors urged caution. But even as the town braced itself, No one suspected that the man regularly chatting with law enforcement was directly tied to the case. Kemper watched the unfolding investigation with a mixture of curiosity and confidence. His proximity to the police gave him insight into their theories, their frustrations, and their blind spots. He listened as they speculated about suspects, patterns, and motives. He offered polite comments, sometimes even joking with them, his calm demeanor reinforcing the illusion that he was merely an observant citizen. His ability to remain composed, despite the growing intensity of the investigation, gave him a sense of control he had never experienced before. It convinced him that his intelligence and his understanding of human behavior placed him beyond suspicion. But outside the cafe and police stations, his personal life deteriorated rapidly. His job at the highway department no longer provided the stability it once did. His mother's harsh criticisms grew more frequent, more biting, and more dismissive. She questioned everything about him, his social life, his career, his habits, even his tone of voice. The emotional escalation mirrored the trajectory of the crime's investigators still struggled to connect. The conflict reached a point where Kemper could no longer separate his internal battles from his external actions. His identity fractured between the polite giant known to police and the growing storm inside his home. During this time, Kemper's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. He oscillated between periods of eerie calm and bursts of agitation. He drove late into the night, wandering aimlessly through town as he tried to escape the emotional pressure at home. But every drive ended the same way. He returned to the house where the conflict waited for him. To Kemper, the arguments were no longer disagreements. They were reminders of the powerlessness he had felt since childhood. And with every confrontation, his belief that his mother was the source of his pain grew stronger. As tensions peaked, the emotional barrier between them began to crack irreparably. His mother dismissed him with a familiarity that cut deeper than she realized. She spoke to him not as an adult, but as the child she had once controlled. Kemper internalized every word, interpreting them as confirmation that he would never escape the role she had assigned him. The resentment that had simmered for years was now boiling at the surface. While this psychological storm raged inside the house, the investigation in Santa Cruz finally began to gain traction. Detectives started identifying subtle consistencies across the cases: pickup locations, victim profiles, and transportation patterns. They recognized that the disappearances were not scattered events, but part of a larger pattern unfolding in the region. The number of missing women grew too large to dismiss. The possibility of a coordinated set of crimes was becoming harder to deny. Kemper sensed the shift. He saw the growing urgency in the voices of the officers he spoke with. He noticed the slight tension in their posture, the careful phrasing in their conversations. He recognized the moment when the investigation transitioned from uncertainty to determination. For the first time, he felt the possibility of exposure hovering around him. Yet inside his home, the emotional stakes outweighed even the threat of capture. The arguments with his mother reached a point where they no longer represented conflict, they represented inevitability. The storm inside him, fed for decades by resentment, isolation, and psychological wounds, was approaching its final breaking point. And soon, that breaking point would collide with the very person who had shaped his identity from childhood, setting the stage for decisions that would unravel both his family and the investigation pursuing the elusive co-ed killer. Before we reach the final chapter, make sure you are subscribed. This last turn in Kemper's story is the one that shocked even seasoned investigators. Imi diganas comentarios. On voca atcha que o caso finalmente escapou do control dele. The final chapter of Edmund Kemper's story began not with a calculated plan, but with a moment where decades of resentment, emotional chaos, and psychological fractures collided. The tension inside the Santa Cruz home he shared with his mother had reached its highest point. Their relationship, long defined by arguments, accusations, and unresolved wounds, could no longer sustain itself. For Kemper, every interaction now felt like a reminder of the powerlessness he carried since childhood. His mother's words, dismissive and sharp, echoed within him long after she spoke them. And one night, the emotional pressure that had built for years erupted in a way that even he could no longer control. In the immediate aftermath, something inside Kemper shifted with startling clarity. The storm that had consumed him for so long suddenly quieted. The emotional weight he carried seemed to lift, replaced by an eerie sense of finality. He believed, with unsettling conviction, that he had confronted the source of his internal chaos. In his mind, he had completed something he considered inevitable. But with that act came a realization few would expect. He no longer felt the compulsion that had driven his earlier decisions. The trajectory that had defined the co-ed killer appeared to stop abruptly. He did not run. He did not hide. Instead, he wandered through Santa Cruz in a state of numb calm, as if the world around him had blurred. He drove aimlessly, stopping only to think, reflect, and process the weight of what he had done. Days passed in a haze. He listened to the radio reports, watched the movement of police cars, and realized something startling. The crimes that had terrorized the community had not yet been connected to him, but they were closing in. Investigators had begun piecing the puzzle together: victim patterns, geographic connections, timelines. The web of evidence was slowly tightening, even if he remained outside their immediate suspicion. The pressure of this realization grew heavier with every passing day. The calm he initially felt began to crumble under the weight of isolation and inevitability. He understood that there was no escaping the consequences of what he had done, not just the crimes in Santa Cruz, but the confrontation inside his home that marked the final fracture in his identity. His past, long hidden beneath layers of charm and careful planning, had finally caught up to him. In a moment of startling clarity, Kemper made a decision that stunned investigators, psychologists, and the public alike. He picked up the phone and dialed the police. The officers who answered knew him as the polite, talkative big guy who often chatted with them at the cafe. But the voice on the line was different: calm, steady, and carrying a weight that could not be ignored. He confessed, not partially, not cautiously, but completely. He revealed details authorities had long been struggling to uncover, walking them through the timeline they had spent months trying to reconstruct. At first, the officers did not believe him. The idea that Edmund Kemper, friendly, articulate, well-mannered, could be the co-ed killer seemed impossible. They assumed he was joking, exaggerating, or in some kind of emotional crisis. But as he continued speaking, weaving together the details of multiple disappearances and the truth behind the rapidly escalating investigation, the reality became undeniable. He knew things no outsider could have known. He described locations, timelines, and circumstances with precision. And most shocking of all, he confessed not as someone seeking escape, but as someone who felt the weight of inevitability finally take hold. When authorities took Kemper into custody, the contrast between his calm demeanor and the gravity of his admissions stunned everyone involved. He cooperated fully, answering questions with a strange mix of detachment and introspection. Investigators, who had spent months chasing leads and forming theories, now sat across from the very person responsible, an intelligent, articulate man who analyzed his own actions with an unsettling level of clarity. His insights provided not only answers, but also a chilling look into the psychological landscape that had shaped him. The trial that followed was swift. The evidence, supported by his own confessions, left little room for interpretation. Psychologists debated his mental state, weighing the complexities of his upbringing, his intelligence, and the emotional scars that defined him. But the court saw through every layer to the undeniable truth of his actions. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, where he would remain under constant observation, becoming one of the most analyzed and discussed offenders in modern criminal history. Inside prison, Kemper became a paradox: cooperative, articulate, and eager to participate in psychological studies. He recorded audiobooks, assisted researchers, and offered interviews that attempted to explain his actions with a disturbing sense of detachment. To some, he appeared reflective. To others, manipulative. But to all, he remained one of the most chilling examples of how intelligence and darkness can coexist within a single individual. In the end, the terrifying case of Edmund Kemper revealed not just a series of crimes, but the complex interplay of trauma, intelligence, emotional dysfunction, and unchecked resentment. His story became a cautionary tale in criminal psychology, a reminder that the most dangerous individuals are often the ones who learn to hide their storms behind ordinary faces.